13-year-old died, not in a fight, not an accident, on social media, live on Instagram. But the person behind it, watching from miles away, was complaining about the camera quality. The victim had been pressured into recording his final moments, live. For some recordings like this were circulated for attention and status. One of the names behind it was White Tiger. Jay was one of the early victims of a network that remains active today. Jay was born female, but at the age of 10, he told his mother he wanted to live as a boy. Over time, he began opening up, first to friends and family, and later, more fully, about his identity. Online, he found communities where he finally felt understood. Jay loved creating. He spent hours making things, drawings, knitting, small handmade pieces. Some of them he even sold online with his mom, not because he had to, but because it made him happy. He just wanted to create something and share it with others. Jay's mental health struggles began during the pandemic. He dealt with depression and an eating disorder. Over time, his parents began noticing wounds on his skin, but he didn't hide it. He spoke openly with them, and together, they tried to understand what he was going through and how to help him cope. His parents sought help at a children's hospital in Seattle. He began therapy and spent time in treatment programs. By late 2021, there were signs of improvement. He seemed happier, spending time with his family, looking forward to going back to school, but there were still concerns. On his computer, his parents found he had been active in online groups on Discord. Not extreme spaces, just teenagers struggling with the same things, trying to support each other. His parents set strict rules to protect him online. They limited his access, monitored his activity, and removed certain groups. He was only allowed to use the internet in shared spaces. But even with all of that, Jay was still searching for connection, for understanding. And in one vulnerable moment, he came across something very different. Early in the morning, January 17th, 2022, just after 6 a.m., in a quiet neighborhood in Gig Harbor near Seattle, two police officers arrive at a house. They ring the doorbell. Moments later, a woman answers, still half awake. They ask about her son. She leads them upstairs to his bedroom. The door opens. The bed is empty. By then, his father has joined them. The officers hesitate, struggling to find the right words, but it doesn't matter. Something is already understood. A short time earlier, their son had been found behind a supermarket near a loading ramp, about a 15-minute walk from home. He had taken his own life. But at the time, no one fully understood what had really happened. They didn't know that their son had been forced to record it, because this wasn't just a personal tragedy. It was something bigger, something that had already begun spreading online. A network forming quietly months before. It had a name, 764, and it wasn't alone. It existed within a larger space, a loose online network where the same patterns appeared: control, manipulation, and harm, where victims weren't seen as people, but as something to be used. In 2021, a network began forming online. It was known as 764. It didn't have a clear structure. It didn't stay in one place, but it started with one person. A 15-year-old American teenager, Bradley Chance Cadenhead, known online as Felix. He first learned these methods in a Discord server called CVLT before creating something of his own. At first, it looked small, just another online group, but it didn't stay that way. It spread across Discord, Telegram, and even gaming platforms like Minecraft and Roblox. And it wasn't random. They targeted vulnerability. Teenagers, often between 9 and 17, especially those struggling with isolation or mental health. They didn't rush. They built trust first. Then they took control, step by step. What started as one person's idea became something much bigger, a decentralized network, one that didn't depend on a single leader. And that's what made it harder to stop. Some described it as something closer to a cult with extremist influences. But that wasn't the end of it. Long before 764 existed, Bradley had already shown warning signs. At school, he was bullied, described as an easy target. By his early teens, he had experienced multiple psychological breakdowns, and over time, he became isolated. At just 15, he dropped out of school and disappeared into his own world. Not long after that, he created 764. Even the name had meaning. It came from the first 3 digits of the zip code in his hometown, Stephenville, Texas. But the signs were there. Years earlier, school authorities had already raised concerns. Nothing changed. Even after disciplinary action, he continued. Online, he kept creating new accounts again and again, even after being banned, until eventually, authorities traced everything back to him. On August 25th, 2021, his home was searched. He was arrested the same day. In 2023, he was convicted and sentenced to 80 years in prison. But his arrest didn't end what he had started. Because by then, 764 was no longer just one person. It had already spread. Different users, different accounts, but the same methods. In April 2025, 2 key members of a related subgroup were arrested in the United States and Greece. Investigators say they played a major role in expanding the network and coordinating activity across encrypted platforms. Their cases are still ongoing, and if convicted, they could face life in prison. And even now, this network is still considered a serious threat. Authorities in multiple countries are still investigating it, and in Canada, 764 has already been officially designated as a terrorist organization. But within that network, some individuals began to stand out, names that kept appearing across different cases. One of them was known as White Tiger. Behind that name was a teenager from Germany, Shahriar J. At the time, he was just 17 years old, one of the most active figures inside the network. But he didn't always act alone. He often stayed in the background, using others, people who had already been drawn in. Some of them were then used to reach new targets, and that's how it spread. In one case, a 12-year-old girl from Northern Europe became part of that chain. She had already been a victim of White Tiger. Over time, she was manipulated, controlled, and pushed to follow instructions. Investigators later found that structured guides were being shared, methods designed to pressure vulnerable users. She was given those instructions. At some point, she approached someone else. According to reports, she contacted Jay under Shahriar's direction and encouraged him towards self-harm. At first, it seemed like a normal conversation, someone who understood him. But over time, the pressure grew. She pushed him further, again and again. He resisted. He said he didn't want to die. He said he still had reasons to live. But the manipulation didn't stop. Investigators believe she used emotional tactics, even pretending they would go through it together. And eventually, something changed. Late that night, he left his house. He set up his phone, while others watched. Some even joined from different places, including the one behind it. And within minutes, it was over. At that moment, it was around 4:30 a.m. in Washington state. In Hamburg, Germany, Shahriar J was watching everything on his phone, in real time. Later, in an online post, he appeared to boast about it, suggesting that someone had died on camera and linking it back to himself.
This case might never have been uncovered if not for a teenager on the other side of the world. A girl in Australia. She had seen something, a video that didn't feel right, not random, not accidental. She had encountered this kind of space before, and she understood what it meant. So she started collecting everything: messages, usernames, fragments of conversations. She began tracing connections. Eventually, she reached someone close to Jay, and from there, she reached his father. She sent everything she had gathered: evidence, accounts, usernames, along with a message. "I'm so sorry you have to see this too. They need to be stopped," she wrote. When Jay's father saw it, he realized something was wrong. This wasn't what they had been told. he sent everything to the local police. That's when investigators began to see it. This wasn't just a single case. There was something behind it, something organized. And that was the moment the investigation truly began. Years passed before everything finally led back to one place: Hamburg, Germany, June 17, 2025. In a quiet residential neighborhood, special police units moved in. No sirens, no noise, just a silent approach. They entered the house, a large villa in one of the city's wealthier districts. Upstairs, in his room, he was still there, sitting in front of his computer. The door was breached. Within seconds, it was over.
Shahriar J was taken into custody. His devices were still running, and that made a difference, because what they found next was far bigger than anyone expected. Chats, videos, files, conversations, and structured material, instructions, methods, and evidence showing how parts of the network operated. Investigators began going through it, piece by piece. Even they needed psychological support to continue. But from the outside, none of it made sense. Shahriar J was an Iranian-German teenager from a wealthy family. His father was a successful entrepreneur in the medical equipment field. He lived in a large family home. He studied medicine at a private university. His professors described him as intelligent, motivated, someone with a future. At home, nothing seemed out of place. His family couldn't believe it. At first, they thought it had to be a mistake, that he had simply clicked on something he shouldn't have. But there was another layer to the story, one that raised even more questions. According to investigators, this could have been stopped earlier. An FBI investigator had already identified Shahriar J's real identity not long after J's death. The information was shared, passed on to authorities in Germany. Even earlier, back in 2021, warnings had already been sent, reports linking him to the same network, to similar patterns, to other victims. At one point, he had been under investigation, but the case didn't move forward, and it was closed. And maybe that was the moment when everything could have been stopped. But Shahriar J didn't stop. He continued, largely unnoticed. But the investigation told a very different story. During the pandemic, he became increasingly isolated. He spent more time online, and that's when everything escalated. According to investigators, his actions were not random. They followed patterns, methods, a system built on control. By the time the case file was completed, it had grown to hundreds of pages. He faced more than 200 charges, linked to over 30 victims, many of them children and teenagers, including some of the most serious crimes investigators deal with. And at the center of it all was the same name that had appeared from the beginning: Shahriar J. By the time Shahriar J was arrested, more than 3 years had already passed. Investigators believe he was linked to hundreds of offenses involving victims across multiple countries, many of them minors. The charges were severe, among them online exploitation, psychological abuse, and multiple counts of attempted murder. The most serious was the case that started it all, but even that wasn't the full picture. What investigators uncovered went far beyond one person. This was part of something larger, a network, one that had already reached across multiple countries. Authorities say victims were identified in Germany, the UK, Canada, and the United States. In the US alone, hundreds of cases were opened. And in Germany, multiple state-level investigations are still ongoing. Some officials believe this may be one of the most extensive online investigations of its kind. And at the center of it was a system designed to manipulate, control, and exploit. A network that didn't rely on one identity or one name, which means even when one case ends, the threat doesn't necessarily disappear. What made this case disturbing wasn't just one person. It was how quietly it spread, through isolation, manipulation, and people who often didn't realize what they were being pulled into until it was too late. Investigators say these kinds of networks often grow in silence, inside private chats, online communities, and emotional vulnerability.
which is why awareness matters. Pay attention to sudden isolation, secretive online behavior, emotional pressure, and communities built around control. If you or someone you know may be experiencing online coercion, self-harm-related pressure, or emotional manipulation, reaching out to someone you trust can make a difference.